Max Verstappen just won the British Grand Prix for his sixth consecutive race win this season and his eighth overall in the 2023 season. He looks pretty much unstoppable. And while Max did get passed for the lead probably for the first time in nearly 3 or 4 months, did you guys really think that McLaren was going to have a shot at taking down Max Verstappen? I will say it was very fun to watch Lando Norris take the lead off for a couple laps, and I will give credit to McLaren. They did keep Max honest, which is a lot more than really even his own teammate has been able to say, given his teammate can actually figure out how to qualify with the best car on the grid. But anyways, it got me thinking, and it really got me thinking really ever since Austria. Can Max Verstappen have the greatest season in Formula One history? And you might be thinking to yourself, well, it should be pretty obvious, shouldn't it be? He's won all but 2 races this year, and those 2 races he didn't win, he still finished second. And he's finished second to his teammates. So at least he's losing to a driver that he theoretically should be losing to. It's not like he's losing to cars that are clearly inferior to the Red Bull. Although I will say, it feels like the field is starting to catch up to Red Bull. I don't think it's really a coincidence nowadays that Sergio is really struggling to qualify ahead of other cars. And Lando was close to Max. Fernando nearly outqualified Max at Monaco. If it wasn't for one of the greatest third sectors we've seen in Formula One history, the field is closing in on the Red Bulls. And that's what I think what is making Max do what he's doing now even that more impressive. Because you got his teammates struggling. And look, Aston Martin, they're on the up and up. They're competing for podiums on a near race by race basis. Mercedes is still in contention. Ferrari's in contention when their strategists decide to actually, learn how to strategize. And now we're seeing McLaren has joined into that mix as well. So the fact that you got all these teams where, honestly, if you take Max out, you'd think it looked more like a NASCAR field than a Formula One field with how much parity there is at the top of the grid. The problem is there's just not a lot of parity at the very, very top, and that's where Max resides. Because, yeah, maybe the battle for second place is still on, but first place, let's be honest here, it's going to be Max before we even head to the next raced weekend. So that's something that got me thinking. Let's get back to the topic at hand. Can Max achieve the greatest season in F1 history? So before I hit record, I put together 3 seasons, 3 of the seasons that I think and many would consider, and actually it's 4 seasons, though the third one you may consider is 50-50, or excuse me, the second one. You can argue should or shouldn't it be on the list. I decided to put it out there anyway. So these 4 seasons that I have, I'm going to try to compare it to Max's season currently, and let's see if Max can beat that. I'm not ranking any of these 4 seasons, so we're basically going to go about them in random order. Let's start off with probably the most popular season that probably the more modern Formula One fan would know of in terms of an outright dominant season. And I'm not going to include Max's 2022 season. While, yes, he did win the most races out of anyone in F1 history that year, which was 15 wins. The next closest is 13, which we'll get to in a second. I am not going to include that on this list. However, the season I am going to include on this list does involve another, albeit former Red Bull driver, still a Red Bull driver, and if that didn't give it away, I'm going to talk about Sebastian Vettel's 2013 season, where he managed to win 13 out of 19 races. So all but 6 races, you saw that number 1 Red Bull on the top of the podium. However, I will say he did manage to finish 16 out of 19 races on the podium. So all but 3 races, Vettel was on the podium. He won the final 9 races in a row. And he had a 2.6 average finish. That is one of the most dominant seasons, not just in Formula One history, but you can make an argument in motorsports history in any discipline. I mean, Jeff Gordon's 1997 season doesn't even come close, in my opinion, to this kind of season. Maybe you can talk about one of Scott McLaughlin's seasons. I believe it was 2019 when he won all but I think like 10 races that year. Maybe a season like that in supercars, or I don't even think there's an IndyCar season where you could compare that to. That is truly one of the most dominating seasons in motorsports. Let's compare that to Max's 2023 season. So currently Max has won 8 out of the 10 races. So he's on pace to beat Vettel in that case. He's finished on the podium in every single race, which, believe it or not, there is a season on my list that I have here, which does have a 100% podium rate. We'll get to that later on. And his average finish is a 1.3, so a whole spot better than Vettel's, and he's on a 6-race win streak. So we'd have to win 3 more races in a row to match that and win 4 in a row to best that. So currently Max is on pace to beat the amount of races won and the amount of podiums and average finish. But can he get to that 9-race win streak? I don't see why he couldn't. Do I think he will? I'm going to go off on a limb, and I'm going to say that Max is not going to break that 9-race win streak. I can see him matching that, but I don't think he's going to break that. And the reason I'm saying that is what I alluded to at the beginning of this episode. The field is starting to close in on Max Verstappen, slowly but surely. It's been very, very, very slow, but if you pay attention, you can notice. Go back to Canada. Yes, Max led every lap, and I believe he had the fastest lap of that race too. However, Leclerc and Alonso and Hamilton, they were keeping Max honest. It wasn't like Max just flat out ran away with it. He still had to account for the Aston Martin and the Mercedes that were behind him. So that wasn't a complete just walk-off win, despite the fact that he led every single lap. Let's go to the Austrian Grand Prix, where, yes, it was off a pit strategy, but Leclerc was still in contention with Max. And Leclerc won that race last year. So Max still had to, albeit he didn't have to do a lot of work, but he still had to work nonetheless to get that Austrian Grand Prix win. So you had the Ferraris that were closing in. You have Aston Martin, Mercedes that were closing in. And this most recent example, we inch even closer, albeit with McLaren of all teams, at the British Grand Prix. I mean, Lando Norris flat out took the lead away from Max at the beginning of the race and had Oscar Piastri maybe put his nose a little bit more in, he probably could have fell all the way back to third. Who knows what kind of race we'd be talking about if that happened. And Lando, he was leading for a good portion of the race. And like I mentioned, he was keeping Max honest. Max never I think the largest lead he got to is 9 seconds. Yes, 9 seconds is a big gap in terms of motorsports, but it wasn't like the 20, 30 seconds we've seen Max put on in other races. So the field is closing in, albeit there's not really a specific team that's closing in. It's more the rest of the field. The problem is the rest of the field is inconsistent. Max is the only consistent driver/team. But they're closing in nonetheless. So I wouldn't be surprised if we finally see someone break that win streak of Max Verstappen. Although Formula One being Formula One, it'll probably be his own teammate Sergio Perez, and we still won't really get that much parity if we even have parity that much this season anyways. So I think Vettel is going to keep that 9-race win streak, or at least he's going to be matched by Max. I don't think it's going to be broken. The next one is the season that I'm talking about that maybe a lot of people may not put on this. Ayrton Senna's 1991 season. He won 6 out of the 16 races, so pretty low margin. I mean, Max has already beaten that this year. His average finish is a 3.4. Max has already beaten that by over 2 positions, but he managed to finish 11 out of 16 races on the podium. Again, Max is already beating that. I think it's pretty easy that Max is going to beat this season in terms of dominance. He's already eclipsed Senna's 1991 by 2 wins, and we're not even halfway done with the season yet. The average finish, I highly doubt Max's average finish is going to go from a 1.3 to a 3.4 unless he gets some DNFs later in the season. And 11 out of 16 podiums, Max is only 1 podium away from matching that and only 2 away from beating that. So I think Max's 2023 season will easily outclass Ayrton Senna's 1991 season. Although Ayrton did have less races, 16 compared to, I believe we're running 22 or 23 this year. So while it is less, I still think that's more of an opportunity for Max to screw up and more of an opportunity for Max to be less dominant. I don't see Max, losing that anytime soon. Michael Schumacher's 2002 season. Let's get to this one. And this one is a little bit interesting. So Schumacher won 11 out of 17 races that year. Max is only 3 wins away from beating that or at least tying that. I don't see why he wouldn't get there. However, Schumacher, although it was only 17 races, he did finish on the podium in every single race. Max is currently on pace to tie that at least. If you really want to get more technical, because he's going to run more races, then he's going to beat that technically. But again, I talked about it before. The field is slowly starting to close in. So the field is slowly starting to inch closer and closer to Verstappen. And do you really think that Max is going to be mistake-free, or at least the team is going to be mistake-free for the rest of the season? I mean, they're probably going to have to take some grid penalties later on in the year. And even though Max has shown that he can win the race from 9th on the grid, what if he has to start further up behind the grid? What if it's 10th, 12th, 14th? Do you really see Max winning then? And like I mentioned before, with the field closing in, is Max really going to be able to work his way through the field as easily as he did earlier in the season? I think Max is going to be really close. I'm not going to make a definitive answer. I could see it going either way. I could see Max finishing every race on the podium as, frankly, as easy I could see it not happening. Again, for the 2 points that I made earlier. And Schumacher's average finish is the closest that Max has to compete with. He had a 1.4 average finish. Currently, Max is ahead of that with a 1.3 average finish. But again, he finishes off the podium or he doesn't win a race or two, Schumacher's 1.4 average finish might be there to stay. And then finally, we'll talk about Lewis Hamilton's 2019 season, which in my opinion, I think is his most dominant year. Even though I do think 2020, he did win either all the same amount of races or one less. Less races, I kind of count into that. Plus, I just look at all the stats anyway. So Lewis Hamilton's 2019 season, he won 11 out of 21 races, so considerably less than some of the other ones on this list, even though it is tied with Schumacher, although Schumacher did run 4 less races than Hamilton. Hamilton's average finish was a 2.4, so Verstappen already has that beat by 1 full position, essentially, well, 1.1. And Hamilton finished on the podium in 17 out of 21 races. So all but 4 races you saw the 7-time world champion on the podium. I don't think Max is going to finish off the podium 4 times this year. I think if he is going to find a couple races off the podium, it would probably be anywhere from 1 to 3. I think 4 races off the podium is a little too much. Again, you're asking for a lot of craziness to happen to see Max Verstappen off the podium 4 times this year, which you think, oh, only 4 races off the podium? That's not terrible. That just shows you how dominant Max has been this year. Again, he's won all but 2 races. So let's look at these 4 seasons again. And I'm going to tell you guys off of whether I think he's absolutely going to best the season. It's 50-50, or I don't think it's going to happen. Let's start off with the easy one, Ayrton Senna's 1991 season. I think it's pretty easy. Max is going to best that season. If not, he's already bested that season. I mean, he's already eclipsed the win mark. He's 2 podiums away from eclipsing the podium mark. And he's already beating the average finish by more than 2 spots. I think Max Verstappen, if he isn't already, he will easily have a better season than Ayrton Senna's 1991 season. Lewis Hamilton's 2019 season. I think that's pretty simple. I think he's going to beat Lewis Hamilton's 2019 season as well. He's already 3 wins away from tying the amount of wins that Hamilton's got. He'll more than likely get there, and he'll more than likely eclipse that. His average finish is already better than Lewis's. I think it'll either be around the same, if not better. And the podium mark, again, I already said before, I think the most amount of podiums Max doesn't have finishes off the season is 3. And that would still be around 19 to 20 podiums on the year. So I easily think Max is going to beat that. Now it gets a little tricky. Michael Schumacher's 2002 season. I think Max is going to beat the wins. Obviously, if I see Max beating Lewis's wins, I see him beating Michael's wins. The 100% podium mark, I don't see it. again, to finish on the podium 100% every single race, even for as dominant as Max has been, that's basically asking for perfection. Even last year when Max won 15 races, he still ran into issues. He had 2 DNFs due to engine issues, and he had damage at the British Grand Prix last year. So even in Max's best season today, where he won 15 out of, I believe, 22 races, to ask to do better in terms of podiums, that's asking for a lot, in my opinion. So I'm going to say that he doesn't get that. Albeit I do think he'll miss it by 1 or 2 podiums. And the average finish of 1.4, I also think that's going to get broken. Or I think Schumacher's going to keep that. Again, have a 1.4 average finish. While, yes, Schumacher didn't win, he lost 6 races and still managed to keep that. So theoretically, Max should be able to have that as well. That's just asking for a lot. Again, that's really difficult. Again, if I don't see Max finishing every race on the podium, I don't see that average finish beating Schumacher's. I think Max will be close, but I think Schumacher's is going to stay that way. So if Max isn't going to have Schumacher's hold in terms of podiums or average finish, you might be thinking, well, Schumacher would have the better season technically, right? I'm going to say no. I'm going to put this in the 50-50 category. And that's because the field is just more competitive. I mean, I talked about it already. You got Lewis Hamilton, a hungry Lewis Hamilton, who hasn't won in over 2 years or nearly 2 years. You got an even hungrier Fernando Alonso, who finally has a competitive car and hasn't won in over a decade. You don't think he's going to do what he needs to do one of these days if he has a chance to win? You got the Ferrari duo, who's always in contention. You got his own teammate, Sergio Perez, who, if he keeps performing like this, he might be out. So he might be driving for his job at this point. And if McLaren continue to perform the way they're performing now, that's asking for a lot. So I'm going to say that because of how competitive the field is this year, compared to how it was in 2004, when you just had Ferrari, maybe Kimi, I think Kimi was around that year, and Fernando, I'm going to say that because, which by that argument, you should say that, oh, because Max is facing a tougher grid, then shouldn't a season be better? And yeah, you can make that argument, but I think because of how competitive the field is, from a statistical standpoint, that's going to hurt his stats. So from a statistical standpoint, which again, that's what we're mostly looking at here, I'm going to say that Schumacher will have the better season. But again, I think that's 50-50, but I'm going to lean that towards Michael Schumacher. Because again, that podium percentage, that average finish, that's going to be really difficult to beat, even if Max is currently besting that right now. And then there's Vettel's 2013 season, where Vettel won 13 races. Max has won more races than the season before. I don't see why you can't do that again. 16 out of 19 podiums. I think that's going to be where around Max is. If not, he's going to be better. So I'm going to say Max is going to have a better podium percentage than that. The average finish, I think Max will have a better average finish. I assume it's going to be anywhere from the high 1s to the low 2s, so I will say that. The 9 wins in a row, I mentioned before, I think Vettel will keep that. If not, Max will tie that. So really the only thing I have Vettel in terms of his best season, besting Max in, and if you even call it besting, is the winning streak. I think Max will get to 7, if not 9. But really after that, I think Max, I don't see Max winning 10 races in a row. I just don't see it happening because, again, how competitive the field is. And again, for how difficult that is to do. But because I have Max basically matching, if not besting, the rest of his stats, I am going to say, again, 50-50, Max is going to have the better season than Vettel did back in 2013. So I have Max having a more dominant season than Lewis. I have Max having a more dominant season than Senna. And I have Max having a more dominant season than Vettel, except for Schumacher. So, based off the list, I think it's close, but I don't see Max having the most dominant season in F1 history. Again, to ask any driver to finish on the podium in every race, to ask a driver to have an average finish of 1.4, That is a tall task to ask any driver. I don't care how dominant your car is. That's basically saying that your car is never going to have mechanical failures. You're never going to run into issues, and you're going to be essentially perfect for the entirety of the year. It's motorsports. Perfect doesn't exist. And if it does exist, it's once in a blue moon, i.e. Michael Schumacher's 2004. I think Max will come really, really close, but I think he's going to just barely miss the mark. Though, I wouldn't be surprised if Max does end up having the most dominant season in F1 history. It certainly will be the most dominant season we've seen in the last 20 years. And you could talk me into saying it will be the most dominant season in F1 history. But again, going off of what I said, the podium percentage, the average finish, all of that taken into account, I personally don't think that Max Verstappen is going to have the most dominant season in F1 history, though I do think it will be really, really close. But I think Michael Schumacher is going to hold on. So that's going to do it for this episode. Again, this is an episode I've really been wanting to make for the past week or two now. Again, just how dominant Max has been. I thought, it's a fun topic to discuss. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, please like this video, share, and subscribe as well to the channel. We're changing some things a little bit here with the format of the channel, so I really hope you guys enjoy that. I mean, the Chicago video is doing really well from earlier in the week. I really appreciate all the support. But if you guys want to listen to the audio version of this, the audio-only version, you can find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Anchor, Amazon, iHeartRadio, and, of course, iTunes, Apple Podcasts. You can find us on all those major platforms. If you guys want to follow me on my social medias, follow me on Twitter and TikTok at Motor Ministry. We have a lot of good conversation there. Talk about all things motorsport, not just Formula One, but NASCAR and IndyCar. We'll even dabble into some other motorsports as well, such as sports car and dirt racing. But thank you guys so much for tuning in as always, and we will see you in the next one.